Good morning. It is Tuesday, the 25th of November. I'm Maeve McMahon, and this is Europe Today, Euronews' daily live fix of European news and analysis. Coming up, it's a nail-biting week with the future of Ukraine at stake and the Kremlin rejecting a counter-proposal put on the table by European leaders. Negotiations are ongoing. And also when it comes to trade. Yesterday, for the first time ever, Europeans got together for lunch in Brussels. On the menu, tariffs, of course. For more on exactly what they chewed over, we can bring in now Euronews' EU editor, Maria Tadeo. Good morning, Maria. Lovely to have you with us. Look, what were the main takeaways from these trade talks? Was there any progress made?
Well, to be a fly on the wall, because Maeve, as you say, this is the first time, or was the first time, that European officials and US officials got together face to face in Brussels since the trade deal was agreed in July. Remember, the European Union now faces 15% tariffs. The Americans have tripled tariffs on European goods. So yesterday, the Europeans made a point to the Americans that they want to see a form of relief, better quotas and exemptions. Of course, when you look at specific items, steel, aluminium, the tariffs are 50%. This is huge. It is a problem for the European Union. Now, the flip side, of course, is the Americans argue not so fast. We want to see a faster implementation of the deal we agreed in July, which got a lot of heat for Ursula von der Leyen. They want to see those commitments when it comes to buying the weapons, the energy, and the digital rules. This is always the sticking point. Not just Trump, every U.S. administration, but the Trump administration is more aggressive, and they argue we want to see much more soft, lenient implementation of the rules.
And that's why the digital rules, of course, they were the elephant in the room yesterday over those talks. How severe is this pressure on the EU to change the rules?
Look, absolutely, because again, going back to this question of the steel and aluminium, the Europeans want to see better terms on that 50% tariff. The Americans have argued that perhaps they can debate, but first they want to see a softer implementation of these digital rules, which of course for the EU are key. But I just want to play you for 1 second a comment yesterday on the red carpet. Euronews was there. Jamie Greer, he is the U.S. Commerce Ambassador. Let's take a look.
The United States has had significant concerns for many years about the Digital Markets Act and similar legislation in the EU. Many times the thresholds are set to the extent that it's nearly only U.S. companies that are captured. The enforcement is quite aggressive at times. It becomes complying with the law can become challenging. Sometimes our companies feel like the goalposts are moved. The fines can be quite large. We know that the European Union, that these laws are important to them. We just want to make sure we're controlling for our companies that have global business models, that their global revenues aren't affected, and a variety of other things that perhaps could be modified to help accommodate their concerns and ours.
And that was Jamie's son, Greer, the U.S. Trade Representative. Maeve, that kind of language on a red carpet with the U.S. Trade Commissioner there, but also the Europeans next to him, that was very aggressive. This is not a very polite thing to say when you're meeting and you're being hosted by someone else. But of course, they are making a very clear point. They want to see the implementation change, and they want to see American companies act in a way that they argue would be fair to their revenues. The problem for the Europeans, of course, is that this goes beyond trade. This is now about the legislation and the rule of the EU. You could argue there is a form of political interference. And yesterday, a U.S. official and a European official told me we see this are two completely different negotiations. Steel is one thing. The digital rules are a different thing.
Okay, Maria Tadeo, Euronews' EU editor, thank you so much for all those details. And of course, for more on that story, you can find specialised reports by our EU News team and of course our trade reporter Peggy Corlin on Euronews.com. But for now, coming up, we'll be joined by Margrethe Vestager, the former EU competition commissioner that President Trump used to call the tax lady, known as one of the main trailblazers of the EU's landmark digital rulebook, and also for having inspired the famous Danish TV show Borgen. The Danish Liberal politician spent 2 terms in Brussels. She was also a government minister back home, a deputy prime minister and a party leader. So Margrethe Vestager, thank you so much for joining us this morning on Europe Today from Copenhagen. Lovely to have you with us.
It's such a pleasure to be with you. Thank you very much for having me.
So look, you were listening to Maria Tadeo there on set. The message yesterday, cut your digital rules for lower EU or US steel tariffs. Are the Americans cornering the Europeans here, do you think?
Well, these are 2 completely different discussions. One is steel and aluminium. It has been going on for years. The second one is about how do we live with technology? because promises were made to Europeans that digital services would be safe to use, just like any other product or service, and that the market actually would be open for competition so that we can get new products and services. This is not crazy. This is not against anyone. This is normal. But this is what you would ask in a normal market.
But how would you be handling this if you were still in office? We can see a lot of your work being undone here, the work that you put in place.
Well, I see that the Commission is continuing the work done because promises were made to Europeans. You know, when one discusses, for instance, the Digital Services Act, this is a very sort of simple piece of legislation, just asking companies who are on our hands, in our devices every day for their products to be safe to use. And of course, what the DMA is asking is that you do not misuse your market power, but, that you have a competitive market. Actually, this is everything that you could ask for. And actually, you do see some of the US states pushing for some of the same things, because it is absolutely essential that you can trust also the digital services that most of us are using every day.
But that is not how the Americans see it. Do you think this could be the beginning of the end of the so-called Brussels effect, where the EU has been setting global standards? Now it could be the United States.
Well, we should not be setting global standards. We set standards for ourselves, because we have a long tradition of making sure that protection of consumers goes hand in hand with innovation. That has been the goal, and actually that has been achieved if you see how that digital market is changing, and more also European companies, they need to be able to reach their customers and not being kept out by gatekeepers.
And how do you strike that balance, though? That is, of course, the problem. Innovate so that innovation can thrive and we also can have strong regulation.
Well, innovation thrives when you see that I want to solve a problem, not just I want to produce another service. And when you look at the European ecosystem, when it comes to everything digital, we have very strong entrepreneurs. We have very strong innovation. The thing is that we do not make sure that they have a market. And the Digital Markets Act is exactly about this, making sure that it's your ideas, your work ethic, the people on your team that gives you a fair chance of getting to the market. We've been discussing this with the Americans ever since I took office. This is not new. What is news is that we actually deliver to Europeans as promised.
But did you overregulate during your term?
Well, I see in the omnibus proposal just tabled that there are actually some quite pragmatic, sensible simplifications when it comes, for instance, to cookies, when it comes to when to implement and how to enforce the AI Act. And I think that is really important because, of course, you can always do better. But one thing is important, and that is that we have promised Europeans that their services would be safe to use for their mental health, for their democracy as such. And that is, of course, core in any democracy, that you stand by the promises made.
And that US-EU trade deal, Margrethe Vestager, was it a bad deal for Europe?
I think it was a wise thing not to take the bait and escalate the conflict. Of course, some areas are not within that deal, but I think in a world like this, some level of predictability is actually worthwhile. And we could conclude the single market and kind of make up for the increased tariffs.
And just what about Ukraine? That is, of course, a big story we're keeping a very close eye on this week. What should the Europeans be doing now to make sure they're heard in these very important talks, to make sure they have a seat at the table?
Well, having followed the developments over the last week, I was completely devastated when I saw the first US proposal. But the negotiations that has been ongoing actually shows that there has been a listening, that European concerns and how we have obliged ourselves to peace in our region. I think that is a positive development, but so far it's completely impossible to say what comes out of it. But I think that the ask to be at the table is completely legitimate.
OK, Margrethe Vestager, thank you so much for that. And I hope you can join us next time here in the studio when you're passing through Brussels. But now,
would be my pleasure.
As you heard now, Ukraine's future is still unsure after the Kremlin said that the European counter-proposal does not work, quote. Leaders from the Coalition of the Willing, i.e. Ukraine's allies, will be gathering today via video call. Our reporters Jakub Yanis and Jorge Lebrero have been comparing the various proposals on the table.
Bypassing Brussels, Washington presented a 28-point blueprint directly negotiated with Moscow to put an end to Russia's all-out war against Ukraine. Europe has now responded. A side-by-side comparison reveals three fundamental differences. What are they? First, money. The US-Russia plan would unblock the frozen Russian assets to create two investment vehicles, with Washington taking half the profits from the Ukraine Reconstruction Fund. The European plan insists that the assets must remain frozen until Russia fully compensates Ukraine for the destruction. Second, security. The US-Russia plan would cap Ukraine's army at 600,000 personnel at all times. Europe raises that limit to 800,000 in peacetime only, giving Kiev the flexibility to scale up if threatened. Crucially, the Europeans demand a seat on a joint security task force alongside Ukraine, refusing to let Washington and Moscow decide the continent's fate alone. Third, territory. The US-Russia plan accepts occupied Crimea, Lugansk and Donetsk regions as to recognize borders changed by force. It all leads us to one fundamental question. Who decides the borders of Europe? An invading military force or the European principles of sovereignty?
And for more context on this, we can now bring in our EU News editor, Margrethe Vestager. Welcome back. Look, the Kremlin has rejected this European plan, but there seems to be a bit of cautious optimism in Brussels. Where do we go from here?
Well, Maeve, no question, because that original 28-point plan obviously was clearly tilted in Russia's favor. The issue here, and this is the crux of the matter, is that what works for Russia does not work for Ukraine, and what works for Ukraine does not work for Russia. Nonetheless, this 28-point plan has changed. We now understand it is 19 points. The Ukrainians also now, yesterday, President Zelensky just checked this, said, after Geneva, remember they met on Sunday, there are fewer points. It is no longer 28. Many correct considerations have been taken into account, but there is a lot of work that needs to be done, and it will be difficult to produce a final document. So obviously what we see here is that the Ukrainians now believe they have managed to insert some of their demands. There is speculation that President Trump and President Zelensky could meet in America this week. There is no date for it. This would be for the critical political points. And then, of course, it does also seem that this deadline for Thursday has somewhat eased.
And that's, of course, indeed good news. And just briefly, the Coalition of the Willing will be gathering today. What are your expectations for their meetings? Well,
Coalition of the Willing, and of course a reminder for our viewers, this is a group of countries that are supportive of the UK, some of the EU, but not just, led by the UK and France. They will gather today. The idea is, what else can the Europeans offer and put on the table to sway this deal in favor of Ukraine? I was told, however, yesterday by a diplomat, it seems that things are moving better. There is less panic compared to a week ago, but also something very important. The Europeans believe that this plan, the 28-point plan as it was done, is over, and this is not a static negotiation. It can improve.
So indeed, cautious optimism. And of course, this topic will be dominating MEPs while they gather as well in Strasbourg this week. And Maria, today you'll be in Strasbourg as well for us tomorrow. So we look forward for your update then. But now this does bring this edition of Europe Today to an end. Thank you so much for tuning in. For more news and analysis, do take a look at euronews.com or keep an eye on our social media networks. You can also check out our new formats, The Ring and 12 Minutes With on Euronews. And I'll be back tomorrow morning here on Euronews. See you then.